gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the webinar. Thank you for attending the 5th session of this workshop on enhancing responsible business in Southeast Asia. This webinar series is jointly organized by the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. First, before we begin, please allow me to share some housekeeping issues. The Chatham House rule applies to this webinar. To post questions, please use the Q&A function. Do identify yourself. Please share your name and institutional affiliation. To raise any technical problems, please use the chat function. Thank you for your cooperation. We will now begin the webinar on business imperatives of environmental protection. This webinar will be moderated by Ms. Sharon Lee Lian Xia. Ms. Sharon, please.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Sharon, coordinator of the Climate Change Program and the ASEAN Study Center in ISEAS. On behalf of ISEAS Yusof Ishak and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, I would like to welcome all of you to this webinar. The topic of today's webinar is the business imperatives of environmental protection. We will explore the business case of protecting the very environment that supplies us with the means of development. Prior to COVID-19, sustainable climate and environment initiatives were on a gradual trajectory to the mainstream with the integration of material, environmental, social, and governance ESG factors into investments and portfolios. However, this pandemic has shifted priorities away from the climate and the environment to focus on immediate health crisis management. Scarce resources have also now been redirected to support economies, businesses, people, and jobs. This panel will examine the impact of the pandemic on the momentum for environmental protection and sustainable ESG investing in Southeast Asia, and how countries can optimize post-loss funding capacities and budgetary discipline to protect and sustain existing and future ESG projects. I have here this morning a women-powered panel. I'm very happy that we are fully represented and we have very well-qualified speakers to address these issues. Our first speaker is Dr. Diana Suhardiman. She's the senior researcher and leader of Research Group Governance and Inclusion at the International Water Group Management Institute, Southeast Asia Regional Office. She's based in Vientiane, Laos. Dr. Diana will speak to us about the issue of governance and implementation of land compensation in the Lao-China Railway project. Contesting the predominantly apolitical approach to economic development as a means to benefit the greater common good, Dr. Diana will unpack these power relations in reshaping the underlying politics of development. Our second speaker is Dr. Angela Trito, a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Emerging Market Studies, Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. She's currently working on 3 interrelated research projects on the Belt and Road Initiative in Southeast Asia. Dr. Angela will speak to us on making the BRI, or Belt and Road Initiatives, environmentally sustainable. And next, we have Ms. Diane Tang Lee, manager at the International Council on Mining and Metals, ICMM in London. Unfortunately, Diane is unable to join us in person today. She has, however, shared her presentation with us, which we will play online later. Diane's key focus areas include tailings management, innovation for tailings reduction, community relations, and socioeconomic contribution of mining and metals. She will be talking to us about the importance of cross-sectoral collaboration in environmental governance with a focus on mining operations in Southeast Asia. And lastly, I have to apologize that due to unforeseen circumstances, Professor Zhang Ling from Yunnan University is not able to join us today. Our speakers will have 15 minutes each to make their presentations, and then we will move on to a round of Q&A after that. I shall now hand over this time to our very first speaker, Dr. Diana Suhardiman. Diana, please.
So can everyone see the screen?
Yes, it looks good.
Yes. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the ISEAS and the SPF Foundation for inviting me in this opportunity to share some of our key research findings. So for today, I would like to present some of the key research findings from a paper or a research that we do together, that I do together with my co-authors, Jessica DiCarlo, Ulavan Kiovilik-Navong, Jonathan Rick, and Alan Nico. The paper is entitled Reassembling State Power Through the Laos-China Railway Project. Yeah, so the research briefly examines the governance and implementation of land compensation for the Laos-China Railway Project. It brings to light the importance of understanding the spatial reach of state power and how the state connects the different segments of its bureaucracy through centralized compensation rules and procedure. It highlights the Lao government's strategy to exert influence and direct national economic development, while linking this with processes of regional economic integrations. It also shows how centralized compensation rules and procedures serve as the central government's means to expand its power, while also at the same time limiting provincial, district, and local authorities' role in the overall project implementations. And towards the end of the presentation, I will also briefly go through some of the potential implication for smallholder livelihood option and strategies. So about the Laos-China Railway itself, at present, the Laos-China Railway has always been positioned as a key infrastructure project. Since 2005, Laos has witnessed a boom in infrastructure projects and significant increase of foreign investments into the country. Hydropower plants, highways, and minings have appeared across the landscape as part of the government's policy to promote foreign direct investment. The Laos-China Railway is one of such projects and a key undertaking also within the China's Belt Road Initiative. As we can see from the picture here, those are some of the construction of the Laos-China Railway near the Luang Prabang province, taken late last year. So within the country's socio-economic development strategies, the railway is meant to transform Laos from a landlocked to a land-linked country, stimulate the country's socio-economic development through revenue collection and local income generations, provide a convenient, fast, and safe transformation system, expand and improve key economic sectors such as business and tourism, and improve China-ASEAN relation and economic integration. So this is a map of the region, Laos, Thailand, and China Yunnan province, where we can see the railway which will connect China Yunnan province to Thailand, passing through Laos, which is the Laos Southern province, Botan to Vientiane capital, and Nasang village is one of our case study that I will present later during today. So just a brief overview of the Laos-China Railway project itself, or the part of the project that is taking place in Laos. The construction actually began a year after the groundbreaking ceremony in December 2015. At present, nearly 90% of the construction was completed, with the railway expected to be operational in 2021. The railway itself, once fully completed, will consist of 167 bridges, 75 tunnels, and 32 stations, passing through 167 villages in 13 districts and 5 provinces in Laos. So while the railway is presented as a means to promote the country's economic development, everyone is also aware that the railway will directly affect 4,411 families, as well as their 3,800 hectares of the land along its route. In 2018, the government has promulgated a new law on railways. This law outlines specific steps that developers must follow, including conducting a feasibility study, baseline survey, and development of rehabilitation and repair plans. Most importantly, the law also stated that displaced and affected households cannot be left economically worse off, and aims to ensure that compensation is awarded in a fair and transparent manner. So in terms of the institutional setup and structure, the government of Laos has set up this institutional structure that comprises of the LCR steering committee led by the minister from the Ministry of Public Work and Transportations, as well as the LCR project management committee led by the vice minister from the same ministry. And both committees comprise of relevant government ministries such as the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestries, the Ministry of Natural Resource and Environment, and the Ministry of Planning and Investment, among others. So these figures kind of detail the nested institutional setup that the central government has set up to kind of deal with compensation and resettlement issues surrounding the Laos-China Railway. As we can see here, the LCR Project Steering Committee and Management Committee is directly connected to the SUB and the Committee of Resettlement and Impact Monitoring, as well as Compensation and Mitigation Committee and Subcommittee at respectively provincial and district level. So formal rules and procedures for compensations. At the request of the Central Level Project Management Committee, provincial and district authorities would formulate compensation rules and procedure for their respective province. So this process actually focused very much on the establishment of the unit price list, or the fixed values for a list of assets such as land, residential area, fish pond, trees, to calculate the total amount to be compensated to affected household. So once this unit price were set, the provincial government would send the list to the provincial and national assemblies for approval. And once approved, the provincial and district level compensation and mitigation committee would devise a plan to visit the affected households and collect information on the types of residential structures, land, crops, trees, and other resources that is classified as affected assets. So during these visits, households were asked to join a group meeting. And during the meeting, they would be asked to identify their land and other properties lost to the Laos-China Railway. The committee would then calculate compensation for all items and ask each household to sign a document stating their agreement of the calculated amount to be compensated. Following the signing of this agreement, provincial and district government asked each affected household to open a bank account where the government would then transfer the compensations. So this institutional setup, procedure, formal rules looks pretty much straightforward and clear. But in practice, however, unit price discussions often within the formal compensation procedures do not involve local authorities and affected households. So in practice, compensation rates often do not necessarily correspond with the pricing realities on the ground. For example, for our village case study, we gathered that the provincial and district compensation and mitigation committees only included items visible on the land on the day that they collected the data, such as the type of crops, fish pond, or trees. They did not, for example, consider other crops such as maize and vegetable that farmers would plant after the rice harvesting season. So just to give you kind of like a real sense about how the compensations and villages' perception about it is taking place, I will take you to Nasang village, which is one of our case study village. Nasang village is located about 40 kilometers from Luang Prabang city. It comprises of 170 inhabitants and 42 households. Villagers rely on agriculture, including both lowland and upland rice cultivation, cash crop gardens, and farm and non-farm employment as their main livelihood activities. In 2016, following instruction from the central government, the district government informed villagers about the Laos-China Railway project. And in early 2017, the district government asked villagers to allow the government to take part of their land, which is needed for the railway constructions. In 2018, district authorities went to the village to collect land and crop data from affected households, especially in relation to the compensation later on. Yeah, so in relation to the smallholder views on the Laos-China railway compensations, all affected households that we interview agreed that they lack access to information on compensation rules and procedures. They were not involved in the initial discussions between provincial and district compensation and mitigation committee. Most of households did not receive any information on the finalized compensation procedure and were unaware of unit values in the provincial governance agreement. Most households also did not understand how the compensation amounts are set, and prior to receiving compensation, all households were unaware as to when they would receive this compensation payment. And this is a citation stated by one of the villagers we interviewed in Nasang village. We did not know anything about the compensation rules and procedures. We only know the amount of compensation payment we should receive, but we didn't know as to how this amount is calculated, by whom, and following which criteria. So in terms of the key research finding, one of our key research findings shows that affected households depended entirely on the compensation and mitigation committee's ability or inability and willingness to apply compensation rules and procedures accordingly. Households were not even aware of the defined values, let alone their legal and policy protection or mechanisms to raise concerns. At the same time, until now, there is no monitoring and evaluation mechanism in place to kind of gather the information from the ground in terms of how affected households view the current compensation and resettlement rules and procedures. So in terms of the key analysis, I think the case study show the significant role played by the state in compensation rules and procedures. It also shows how the centralized compensation rules and procedure can serve as a procedural and political means to connect and synergize the central government and provincial and district governments' development visions. In this way, rules and procedures are applied in ways that mirror central level mandates and limit the space for contestations, in this case by local authorities and affected households. And lastly, as affected households were unaware of how compensation rates were determined or what they should receive, provincial and district government could impose variations on rules. They might not necessarily be in line with the formal compensation rules. So this leaves some room for kind of corruption or other rule variation, which can be both legal and illegal. Similarly, affected households also lack the ability to inform district government or provincial assembly about any possible discrepancy because they lack information about the process and how the decision making is done in transparent or intransparent way. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Diana. We'll save the questions for Q&A, and once again, I want to repeat, please state your name and affiliation when you're posing a question in the Q&A box. And now over to Dr. Angela. Angela, please.
All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you all for listening. My name is Angela Tritto, and as Sharon mentioned, I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Emerging Market Studies and at the newly established Center for Global China at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And today I will be sharing a bit the content of my research, which looks at the sustainability of the Belt and Road Initiative in Southeast Asia. The content of this presentation include a little section in which I'm going to define a bit the Belt and Road and what are Belt and Road projects. making a point about the role of the agency of host country governments. And in the second part, I will be talking a bit about the sustainability trends and impacts observed across countries, the effect of COVID-19, and my thoughts on how to make the BRI more sustainable. So let's start by defining China's Belt and Road Initiative. We can say that it is an economic and political mobilization, mainly focused on connectivity by investing and building hard and soft infrastructure in participating countries. We can also say it is a policy that informs China's overseas presence. And we can say that it is a platform for China to interface with host countries and with the third parties, like the US or the EU. So the first point that I wanted to talk about is that the BRI is just not only about China, and we have seen many unilateral narratives that do not account for the role of the agency of host countries. However, scholars, including myself, recognize the role of participating countries in the selection, negotiation, and management of BRI projects, which I outline in this brief that I wrote last year, and you can take a look if you have time. So according to my own understanding of the BRI, we can divide the Chinese investments after 2013 into three main categories. The first one includes Belt and Road flagship projects, which are the ones where we see a strong strategic alignment of interests between China and host country governments. And for instance, we can see the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail in Indonesia, the ECRL and the Malaysia-China Kuantan Industrial Park in Malaysia, and the Chap Q Special Economic Zone and Deep Sea Port in Myanmar. Then we have a variety of projects that are facilitated by the BRI, where we see a good alignment of strategic interests between China and host countries. And here we really see the agency of different countries in attracting various types of investments in either fossil fuels or renewable energy and different types of manufacturing investments. And finally, we have investments that, in my opinion, are definitely not part of the BRI, as there is a clear misalignment of interests. And at times, this can even be illicit investments. And for instance, example of this include the wave of Chinese P2P lending firms in Indonesia that started in 2016, real estate investments in Malaysia, and investments into mining, casinos, and plantations in Myanmar. So let's talk a bit about BRI flagship projects. Usually they are large infrastructure projects related to connectivity that bring new technologies, capital, and skills to participating countries. They are often negotiated at very top level during BRI forums or during official visits. And they proceed at very fast rate of implementation, often without adequate planning. So in terms of sustainability considerations, on the negative side, these projects often have been criticized for bypassing environmental impact assessments and for lacking proper engagement with local communities. However, on the positive side, we have seen that the very high visibility of these projects makes them more transparent, relatively more transparent and open to scrutiny. Then we have a large amount of projects that are facilitated by the BRI. And regarding this, I wanted to give you a quick snapshot of a new project that I'm carrying out, which seeks to divide investments into four main categories. The first one is green, where we see renewable energy and environmental technologies. The second one is black, where we see mainly fossil fuels and investments in minerals and metal manufacturing. The third one is digital, where we see ICT and new technologies. And then all the other investments are marked under other. So in this slide, we see some of the preliminary results. And one main point that I would like to show you is that some countries have definitely managed to attract more investments after the launch of the Belt and Road initiatives. And these are Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. And when we look more carefully, these are the same results, but into percentage. We see that there are interesting patterns. For instance, Indonesia's commitment towards using fossil fuels remain constant both before and after the Belt and Road Initiative, whereas countries like Laos and Cambodia have reduced investments into fossil fuels after the BRI. Myanmar also has had many investments in fossil fuels. However, they are mostly using natural gas as opposed to coal. Malaysia, together with Vietnam, are the countries that have definitely had the largest increase of green investments after the BRI. And also we see countries like Thailand that generally have received much less investments than fossil fuels, both before and after the BRI. So we can see that these patterns are not only related to resource endowment, but also to the agency of these countries and their willingness and commitment towards renewable energy transition and towards attracting investments that are more green. So from now on, I would like to zoom into the case of Indonesia. And this is what Chinese investments in Indonesia look like before and after the Belt and Road Initiative was launched. What do you see? The first thing that is really evident is that there was a very large increase in heavy industry, especially in the steel production and ferronickel smelters. And the second one is the energy sector, where basically China has moved from investments into mining to investments into coal power plants. And some new areas of investments are also in residential, industrial estates, and also tourism and ICT. And here I just wanted to show you the distribution of Chinese investments across Indonesia, which basically shows that apart from Java, the place that has received the largest amount of investments is Sulawesi, where basically we see large deposits of raw minerals. And where we see the largest Chinese investments after the BRI, which is the Indonesia Morowali Industrial Park, which started in 2009, but actually it really took off after the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is a very large smelter plant, basically that takes iron and nickel from the area and converts it into stainless steel. And this investment is connected to China's large consumption of nickel, for which China accounts for half of the world's consumption. And this is mostly used to build stainless steel, which is in turn used for the construction of infrastructure. And basically the main sources of nickel for China are Indonesia and the Philippines. However, you see in this chart that Indonesia, starting from 2014, implemented a ban on the export of raw minerals, and therefore this triggered the large amount of investments into smelter plants that you can see, that you have just seen in the previous chart. The other large investments that are happening are in the construction of coal power plants. So in one of my previous studies, I found that 17 new deals for new coal power plants were made after the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative in Indonesia. And these deals were made both by state-owned enterprises and by private sector companies. And here we see the financing of coal power plants, which peaked between 2013 and 2015, and then suddenly stopped. And this can be a result of different factors, including the signing of the Paris Agreement, but also a stronger commitment for promoting a Green Belt and Road Initiative, but also an effect of the capital control law that was implemented by China in 2017. So we see that even though Indonesia was perhaps one of the countries that was able to take the most advantage of the BRI because it has obtained by far the largest amount of, the largest increase in investments after 2013, we also see that most of these investments are at Indonesia's request into the construction of coal power plants and also into energy intensive and resource depleting industries. And most of these industries have also high level of elite interest and high risk of corruption. And recent NGO reports show the worsening of environmental conditions across these mining areas. And also a recent study shows the implication of this on health, as Indonesia is going to be one of the countries that will be most affected by the construction of coal power plants, with a very large number of premature deaths connected to this. So to conclude, how to make the BRI more sustainable, I think generally when it comes to BRI flagship projects, the most important thing is to allocate more time for planning and ensure mechanisms to engage multiple stakeholders are in place, and also to ensure tech and skill transfers. When it comes to BRI facilitated projects from the Chinese investor side, there should be a stronger commitment towards corporate social responsibility, better engagement with local stakeholders, and also more commitment and assertiveness towards bringing green technologies and green investments. While on the host country side, there should be, most importantly, a commitment at top level towards only attracting green investments, which should inform the screening mechanisms for indirect investments and stronger environmental impact assessments and participatory mechanisms. And finally, on non-BRI projects, there could be more cooperation and information sharing between the Chinese and the host governments to monitor, prevent, and contain illicit investments. Other possible solutions are actually quite simple, and they include adopting more transparent and inclusive process of negotiations, move towards more cooperative modes of governance to avoid rivalry and a race to the bottom. Chinese lenders could also become more proactive in developing, applying, and diffusing environmental and social standards, and diffusing social and environmental innovations that have been successful inside China. For instance, the concept of ecological red lines. And Chinese lenders could also commit, like other lenders have done, to not funding any more coal power plants, and to the conversion of the existing deals that are under negotiation. So this is all from me, and I thank you for listening.
Thank you, Angela. And now we will screen the presentation by Diane Tang Lee.
Hi, everyone. My name is Diane, and I'm a manager at the International Council on Mining and Metals. I'm very happy to be here with all of you today, and thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me to speak about cross-sector collaboration on environmental governance. So an overview of my presentation, I will first be outlining the mining activities in Southeast Asia, and then I'll go on to talk a little bit about tailings, what they are and their potential impact on the environment, which will then lead us to the Global Tailings Review, which is a cross-sector approach to enhance the safety of tailings facilities across the globe. And I'll conclude by drawing some implications of such a cross-sector partnership on sustainable ESG investing. So, mining activities in Southeast Asia. Those of you who might not be very familiar with the mining industry, or not very familiar with how important it is for Southeast Asia. So here are some statistics from 2010 to 16, some average figures. As you can see here, some of the largest or major mining countries in Southeast Asia are Indonesia, Laos, and Myanmar. And I've looked at their production value, which is the metals and mineral and coal production value as a percentage of their GDP, and also the export contribution as a total as a percentage of total export across these countries. And where are these mine sites generally? So I've highlighted here in this map some of the largest operating mines in Southeast Asia. Here you can see that in Laos, the Sepon mine and the Phu Kham mines are the largest and have contributed to around 90% of the total mining production in the country. In Vietnam, this Nguyen Phu is the world's largest tungsten mine. In Myanmar, the Chinese state-owned companies, enterprises operate two of the largest mines in Myanmar, which are the Monhua copper mine and the Tagang Town nickel mine here. This map shows you where the largest mines are in Indonesia. You can see here Grasberg copper is one of the largest mines in Indonesia. And there is also, of course, a cluster of coal mines here in this part of Indonesia. So the focus of my presentation today is on tailings and the Global Tailings Review that we co-convened with United Nations Environment Programme and Principles for Responsible Investment. First of all, what are tailings? Tailings is a common byproduct of the process of extracting valuable minerals and metals from mined ore. They usually take the form of liquid slurry and are made of fine mineral particles. They are created as mined ore is crushed, ground, and processed. To mine and produce metals and minerals sustainably, effective tailings management is really important. Because as you can imagine, if the tailings dam break, it will cause significant harm to the environment. Two of the recent and most serious tailings dam failures happened in Brazil, one in 2015 in Samarco, and another just last year in January in Brumadinho. The collapse caused a mudslide to hit the town of Brumadinho, and this accident is considered to be one of the worst environmental disasters in Brazilian history, where more than 250 people died. For the most part, tailings storage facilities have been historically well managed, with few incidents of failure. However, when they do fail, the consequences can be catastrophic for communities, local economies, and the surrounding environment. Responsible tailings management requires companies to consider the management and governance of tailings storage facilities from the design, construction, operation through to closure. Last year, the Investor Mining and Tailings Safety Initiative, led by the Church of England Pensions Board and the Swedish Council of Ethics, requested the disclosure of tailings facilities from companies around the world. 45 out of the 50 largest mining companies in the world responded. 65% of the industry by market cap also fully disclosed. As for ICMM members, all of our publicly listed member companies responded. However, it is worth noting that much of the data in China and Southeast Asia is still lacking. So, what did ICMM do in response to the Brumadinho tailings disaster? We co-convened an urgent meeting in which our Council of CEOs, representing 27 member companies, decided to develop an industry standard on tailings. Our members are committed to a standard that will bring a significant step forward in safer tailings facility management to restore the confidence of key stakeholders, including investors and local communities. The standard was informed by and developed through an independent review of current global best practices in the mining industry and beyond. And we decided right from the beginning that adherence to this standard will become part of the membership requirements of ICMM. A crucial question is, how do we then engage external parties in a manner that underscores the independence and integrity of the review process and supports the delivery of a pragmatic, progressive, and workable outcome that members will be willing to implement? So that is very much related to the governance structure that we put in place for the Global Tailings Review. To be a very credible process, it needs to be multi-stakeholder. A wholly industry-owned process would not be regarded as credible and would therefore serve no purpose. We therefore agreed with United Nations Environment Programme and Principles for Responsible Investing to co-convene the Global Tailings Review. The co-conveners were committed to engaging representatives from civil society, communities, industry, investors, and multilateral organizations, as well as engineers and subject matter experts, to determine the detailed scope of the review, instilling confidence in stakeholders by considering their view as critical success factor. The co-conveners were also equally invested in achieving a workable outcome to avoid inhibiting uptake and implementation by ICMM members or others within the industry. We also had equal say. Key decisions relating to the overall process were made by mutual agreement between the three co-conveners. For example, we jointly appointed a chair, Bruno Oberle, that is regarded as objective and impartial, and he in turn appointed an independent expert panel. The standard was developed through an independent process chaired by, as I said, Dr. Bruno Oberle, who is a former state secretary for the environment in Switzerland. He was supported by a multi-stakeholder expert panel and with input from a multi-stakeholder advisory group. They conducted a global tailings review that is informed by existing good practice and findings from past tailings facility failures. As part of the research of this review, the chair, Dr. Oberle, traveled to Brazil to see firsthand the tragic impact that the tailings dam failures have had on the people, on the communities and environments. He engaged with communities, companies, and government representatives in British Columbia, Canada, to learn about how the tailings are regulated and managed. And the expert panel evaluated current best practices and lessons learned in the mining industry to make this review as robust as possible. The multi-stakeholder advisory group and co-conveners provided consultative feedback on 2 initial drafts of the standard, which resulted in refinements in the drafts. So that was briefly the process that took place. And crucially, there was a global public consultation that ran between November to December last year. During this period, feedback was collected from a diverse range of stakeholders on the draft standard. A broad and inclusive approach to the public consultation was taken, and it included an online consultation in 7 languages, a number of regional in-country consultations across mining jurisdictions in both the northern and southern hemispheres, and there were also 4 webinars focused on ESG and technical aspects, held in 3 different languages. In total, we had more than 600 individuals and organizations that participated in the public consultation process. In the final phase, the chair, Dr. Oberle, and the expert panel considered the consultation responses and finalized the standard. The Global Tailings Review is committed to transparency, and so the chair has published a consultation report that reflects feedback, key themes and topics and sentiments from different stakeholder groups, as well as how the feedback was processed and addressed in the final draft of the standard. So the product, the result of this review process is a standard that strengthens existing environmental, social, and governance requirements in the mining industry by integrating social, environmental, and technical considerations in a comprehensive manner that will be new to a number of regions. It covers the entire tailings facility life cycle, from the site selection to design to construction, through to management and monitoring and closure and post-closure. The standard elevates accountability to the highest organizational levels and adding new requirements for independent oversight. It also establishes clear expectations around global transparency and disclosure requirements, helping to improve understanding by interested stakeholders. And what are the implications of this global tailings review process and its outcomes on sustainable ESG investing? I strongly believe that to create a real impact, industry responsible investors, along with governments and civil society actors, need to partner together collaboratively. The standard has been endorsed by the co-conveners, who will call for its broad and effective implementation across the industry, and we will advance uptake through our respective organizations. For example, the Principles for Responsible Investment, representing more than 100 trillion assets under management, will be developing investor expectations to support all mining companies in implementing the standard. They expect that all mining companies will comply with this framework, and responsible investors looking to address the risks of tailings failure now have a responsibility to drive implementation, incorporating the standard into stewardship and active ownership strategies. As for ICMM company members, representing around a third of the industry, we will be implementing the standard as a commitment of membership, which includes robust site-level validation and third-party assessments. The standard will be integrated into ICMM's existing member commitments, which includes third-party assurance and validation. For UNEP, they will support governments and will that wish to incorporate and build upon the standard into their national or state legislation and policies. So this global tailings review and the products, the global industry standard on tailings management, are a robust stakeholder process, which has drawn on the global experience of a wide range of stakeholders. As with any multi-stakeholder initiative, this process is very complex, but the results are far more impactful. The breadth of expertise included through this collaboration process has created a standard that sets a new and significantly higher global benchmark to drive global practice. With that, I will conclude my presentation. I'm sorry that this is a video recording and I won't be able to take any questions from you, but if you do have any questions, please feel free to get in touch with me and I'll be happy to respond to you through emails. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you to all our presenters for the very insightful and critical presentations. And as Diane mentioned, you're free to type your question to her in the Q&A, but please just specify that the question is for her. Alternatively, you can email us at admin@ics.edu.sg and we will convey your questions to her. I repeat, the email address is admin@ics.edu.sg. So may I invite our panel to come online? Yes, thank you. So as the moderator, I have the prerogative of asking the very first question. As you all know, the major news of this week has been President Xi Jinping making the announcement that China will reach carbon neutral status by 2060. Do you think that this new pronouncement will make an impact on China's overseas BRI projects and whether there will be a greater impetus for Chinese companies to adhere to ESG reporting requirements? Angela, would you like to take this question?
Yeah, sure. I've been looking at this very closely, actually, and I mean, we should all hope that this is achieved as a goal. However, the reality shows a different picture. So I've been looking at Chinese investments in coal inside China, and this year has seen a return to coal after COVID-19. But I think that the overseas presence, what I have observed is also that investments in fossil fuels receive more criticism, and they are also more open to disputes. And so I think that generally Chinese investors will be more reluctant to invest in very environmentally degrading activities. And hopefully, the great policy of Greening the Belt and Road Initiative would translate into implementation, because that is usually the problem, that like there is a great policy and a great commitment goal, but the implementation usually is the part where things fall apart.
That's right. Dr. Diana, do you have any comments on that question?
Yes, thank you, Sharon. Yes, I think as I would like to echo Angela's point in terms of linking policy and implementation. I think it's nice to have this stated officially and also maybe translated into the policy papers. But I think something that we need to also take into account is that all these BRI project, at least in the Southeast Asian countries that I am aware of, they were all in a very advanced stage. So the question would be how to translate that ESG in that context, or like especially in the context where like in the Laos-China Railway is almost completed.
That's right. Okay, we have received some questions from the audience. The first one is from my colleague, Ben, from ICEUS. The question is, how has COVID-19 affected the infrastructure projects in mainland Southeast Asia, and what is the status of ESG investments in these countries at this time, bearing in mind that COVID has impacted many decisions? Maybe Angela first and then Diana.
Yeah, thank you, Benjamin, for this question. I actually made a slide and then I think it didn't save about COVID-19. So thank you for asking this question. I've been looking at my countries of reference, which are Indonesia, Malaysia, and Myanmar, and I've seen that the flagship BRI projects are definitely moving ahead. So the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail has been delayed. However, things are moving forward. The ECRL and the MCKIP, the industrial parks, are receiving more investments in this year. Also, well, Myanmar is maybe one of the cases that is still under negotiation. But in Myanmar, we have seen a lot of interesting projects that relate to digitalization. And so we have seen really many countries taking this opportunity to strengthen their digital policies. And for instance, in Myanmar, there is a really interesting initiative that looks at digitalizing the e-commerce across the border. And yeah, generally, we haven't seen a clear trend. Everyone is looking whether, there will be more, this will be an opportunity to move to renewable energy and to start over. But generally, some projects are already under construction or in later stage of negotiation. And if those projects are in coal, they might move. I saw one project that was cancelled, like one coal power plant in Indonesia, but I think generally most are moving ahead.
Diana?
Yes, thank you, Sharon.
Yes, would you like to comment on the question from Ben?
Yes, I think I can speak for Laos in particular. I think where a lot of due to travel restrictions following COVID-19 responses, I think many of the consultation processes that have to take place have been postponed. And we don't know in terms of what the consequences that will have for the actual decision making. I'm speaking about the Luang Prabang hydropower dams, for example. And we also learned that like some of the companies coming to Laos with their staff and conducted and decided to pursue some of the mining activities, and in some cases there is also an issue of outbreak, like local outbreak. So it has, I think, both implication in terms of ESG, but at the same time also in the context of the health and safety measures that that kind of like goes beyond ESG and the government part of the is it the mining or hydropower or other infrastructure development. So yeah, and I think in terms of the environmental and social governance, I think in the past when things failed at the transboundary or at the regional level, when things doesn't materialize, local community or transnational NGO and civil society organization can organize themselves and serve as a pressure group to like regional governing body or to the national government. But I think in the context of COVID, that transnational social movement is also very much hampered because of the limited restriction, and I mean travel restrictions doesn't make it easy for people even at the local level. Even when the village is just across the river, they cannot technically or legally enter the other side of the river. So I think that kind of so in general we can say that it hinders in terms of processes of ESG. And at the same time also limit spaces of engagement, because when we still can do webinar and online presentation, I think in the context of local community engagement, it is very difficult to do it online. And at the same time, we don't even know whether this will also, like this kind of like political vacuum, right, or social engagement vacuum, what will be the consequences? Will that result in decision taken regardless of what whether or not consultation have taken place in its full capacity? We don't know.
Yeah, I think certainly COVID has introduced so many uncertainties and unpredictabilities in policy making and investment decisions. But also on the other hand, COVID has brought about a growing narrative that economies need to build back better. We need to have a green recovery, and the question then is, how do governments, mainstream that idea into their policies and into their stimulus dollars that's being pumped into the economies. Moving on, another colleague of mine, Benjamin, has asked, what are some notable ESG practices that have emerged from countries in Southeast Asia? Angela, would you like to take that?
I think, well, from my area, because I've looked mostly into very large scale projects, and so I haven't really seen any case that I would well, one case I would say that is very positive is the case of Myanmar. Basically, Myanmar has created an online platform which is called the Project Bank to basically streamline the screening of large-scale projects, and also to open up a lot of projects that are closed. For instance, some projects that perhaps are put forward by Chinese companies, they are open also for other companies or financiers to participate, and also they become more transparent. So basically they have created this online platform also with the help of the World Bank to basically make the selection of large infrastructure projects in the country more open. And I think this is very important starting point towards ESG governance.
And in your study of these BRI projects, do you see a trend, just related to Ben's question, do you see a trend of host countries pushing for greater legislation, for instance, in legislating domestic EIAs to be conducted so as to protect like the local communities from possible environmental damage and harm?
I see a lot of restructuring, institutional restructuring and policies that relate to attracting more investments by giving incentives or also by facilitating the land acquisition or labor laws. But in terms of environmental impact assessments, I'm also not a big fan, because usually there is a clear conflict of interest when it comes to EIAs. And I think the main question is how to prevent this. So basically companies are paying for EIAs that then become, just a sign off of projects. And so there is also a need to ensure that whoever carries out these environmental impact assessments are, respectable companies, and they do it also by consulting the local communities. But this sometimes is not often done according to, what I've seen so far, sadly.
And this, the idea of consulting with local communities brings us to the next question from Jason, directed to Dr. Suhardiman. How do you include inputs from the stakeholders, including the very same people affected by displacement?
Yeah, I think there are various ways to include stakeholders' inputs and also affected people's views and perceptions. I think we have formal procedures, but in my experience, I think formal procedure doesn't always cover everything, because even in this case, the Laos-China Railway, even the central government is very committed to kind of implement it and ensure that the affected people would not be ending up worse off than before. I think, again, the issue is like the implementation, right? And how to include the key stakeholders. For the Laos-China Railway, we see that the government applies a very centralized system to make sure that the central government is in charge in terms of determining the compensation rules and the resettlement procedures and everything. But at the same time, I think they could not also, it's very hard to afford or to give full spaces of engagement from the local communities, because I think everyone is aware that having a full participation or full inclusion for a large infrastructure project will also create a lot of delay in the project implementation. And to what extent they are willing to take that risk is also another matter, because then the issue becomes, the question becomes, which priority are you following, the ESG priority or the economic development priorities? And that's, I think, is always kind of like trying to find the right balance. And of course, in terms of like all the formal procedures, it's sometimes, like Angela said, also with the EIA, it's sometimes become a rubber stamp, become a measure of ticking the box. And in this case, also with the compensation, it becomes something that, okay, we did it. But to what extent local community view it as fair and transparent process, it's a different matter. And I think monitoring and evaluation should also be done involving a third party, because if you are conducting all these processes and then you are monitoring and evaluating it yourself, there is deemed to be like a conflict of interest, right? It applies for all sorts of government and type of institutions and businesses. You cannot monitor and evaluate something that you create or something that you implement. And I think that, so in terms, just like also in relation to the previous question by Benjamin Hu, I think I think so far, based on my experience in Southeast Asia, I think I would say that the most effective ESG mechanism is through sometimes like a combination of all things. Like we need to know the legal aspect and the legal landscape in terms of identifying pathways for influence and engagement from local community and other key stakeholders. And at the same time, I think building strategic alliances with the different key stakeholders is also key. So we are not just focusing on one entry point, but trying a multi-pronged approach, like through formal system, through informal system, through social movement, through pressure group, to like lobbying with the policy actors themselves.
We have a final question from Dorcas Gan, who's asking how involved should governments, businesses, and public-private partnerships be in this debate, the environmental protection debate. And related to that, I'm not really sure when she asks where the money should come from, whether it's related to any particular project or just utilizing money in the environmental debate. So you can choose not to answer the second one. But really, basically, how involved should governments, businesses, and PPPs be? Up to tackling this question, Angela, or maybe
Yeah, I can take. It's fine. I can take the first go. I think, in my opinion, the government should always be there because it is the government's role to safeguard the environment and society's well-being. So, but generally, we have seen that. I remember one of the talks that I listened to by Chandran Nair, and his main point is always that we cannot expect companies to act in the benefit of the environment and society, because that's not their role. Their role is to make money. So I think that generally there should always be someone who watches out for the environmental and social consequences of investments. But also, I think that in some cases, there is not enough capacity also for monitoring and evaluation. So one key point is how to bring together different actors at different levels, at national level or at local level, to expand this capacity to collect data, to engage with different stakeholders, to monitor, and so on. And the funding, I guess, yeah, there might be different mechanisms, but usually I think that overall the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail project was an interesting case because the Indonesian government did not want to take money out of the state budget for this. And so somehow they pushed state-owned enterprises to finance this project through the loan by CTB. So basically, it is an interesting model that has never really been tested before. So I think we can count it as a kind of innovation that somehow pushes this company to make the project more sustainable and also puts them a bit under the spotlight.
I think that in both of your presentations, as well as with Diana Tang Lee's presentation, the whole idea that businesses are just doing business off extracting natural resources. This whole idea that they need to come around to that if you don't protect the environment, then there is nothing at the end of the day for you to conduct business with. Because if you just keep taking and damaging the environment, in the end, the ones who will suffer the most would be ourselves, the people who are living on this planet. The last question comes from me, really. How do you improve the overall ESG reporting in this region? How do you increase transparency, accountability? And in relation to this, when I heard from Angela that the China banks are now their own financiers, of these projects, that's really shifting that narrative, because in the past few years we've had a lot of banks were coming under scrutiny for financing coal and fossil fuel projects, but less so the Chinese banks. So if the Chinese are now their own lenders, how do you increase that the pressure on ESG reporting and transparency and accountability? So anyone's free to take this question.
To me, it's a matter of the top level commitment. So usually you see that when top leaders are committed, then they somehow shape institutions or like put pressure on them to, to basically follow, more sustainable standards. But I think that it really has to come from everyone in the leadership of these institutions to move to do this transition. And also, I think there's always an element of, everyone can always be there to watch these projects and, keep an eye on the impacts that they create. Yeah.
Any last words from Dr. Diana?
Yes, thank you, Sharon. I think I would say that whatever we do, we need a kind of a nested polycentric governing system. So we cannot just leave this type of efforts or aims to kind of build strategic alliances or ensure ESG screening only at the highest level or at the regional level or at the national level or at the local level, but we kind of have to find a way to connect all the dots, because what we also often see in the Mekong is the issue of the example of the Mekong River Commission with its procedure for notification, prior consultation and agreement, right? Procedure-wise, it's a perfect system. Like they will consult at regional, national, and local level, but at the same time, the institutional mechanism and rules and formal legal rules at regional, national, and local level are not connected. So everyone just go in their own direction. I mean, the company would say, I have conducted my resettlement action plan consultation, so I don't have to kind of fulfill to this PNPCA rule at the regional level. And local community could not even bargain about their resettlement packages, because the discussion take place in two different institutional setup conducted by two different actors at two different levels, while in fact we are talking about the same dam and the same local community. So I think that kind of institutional and legal discrepancy and pluralism need to also be connected.
And we have a question from a Japanese audience. I'll now pass this time to the interpreter to ask the question in English.
Yes, this is the voice of the interpreter. The question is posed by Miss Sanae Hayashi. No affiliation, but Miss Sanae Hayashi. And the question is, in order to protect the environment, have there been cases where human rights have been undermined, or vice versa? Are there mutually complementary cases where both the human rights and environment were both protected? Thank you. That's the question from Miss Hayashi.
I can go for this question first, yeah? I think if you haven't heard, I would suggest you to Google this initiative called the Salween Peace Park, where I think it is located in Myanmar, but also bordering Thailand. It's a peace park that is formed or established through enormous efforts, I think, by local community living in the area together and facilitated by civil society organizations, the Karen Environmental and Social Action Network. I think this year it has received the Equity Principle Award. And I think it shows in terms of the close interlinkages between ESG or environmental governance with the issue of human rights, because I think you cannot split the two. You cannot treat the two in isolation from each other. And oftentimes it is kind of like presented as a two or like both end of the spectrum. You have to preserve the environment, and that means that you will jeopardize some of the local community livelihood options, like in the case of the capture fisheries. But I think the Southwind Peace Park shows that environmental conservation and environmental governance will only work when it is an integral part of human rights approaches to natural resource governance. And by natural resource governance, it includes also the issue of conflict resolutions, livelihood options, and environmental protection.
Absolutely. Angela, any comments?
Yeah, I completely agree. And also, there is a very strong link between environment and human rights issues. And I was explaining to some of my students some of the impacts of mining last week, and how there is really a lot of research that shows how, mining really impacts local communities and contaminates land, water, which in turn affects their livelihood. And then in turn, it has been connected to the use of drugs and prostitution even. So it creates really a massive effect on the local communities. And in a way, like we have just shifted these environmental and social impacts from developed countries to developing one, because the minerals are in everything that we use. So in our iPhones, in everything, we just don't have this in our own countries anymore. Like, we manage it more sustainably, but in the end, the very large impacts are now moved to the developing world, and also they create more inequality because usually it's the people that do not have any other option apart from living in these places that have to bear the cost.
Yeah, they're not the direct beneficiaries as well most of the time from the investments that's come, maybe in some forms of jobs, but otherwise they are very much left unprotected. Well, I think we've come to the end of the webinar, and I want to thank both our speakers for your presentations and to our audience for participating. Our final and concluding webinar under the series of Enhancing Responsible Business in Southeast Asia will be on the topic of the future of responsible business. And the webinar will be held next Wednesday, also at 9:30 a.m. Singapore time and 10:30 a.m. Tokyo time. So we look forward to connecting with you again next week. And in the meantime, please take care and have a good day ahead. Thank you so much, Dr. Angela and Diana.
Thank you.
Thank you.